Hi, my name is Joel Chavez. I am a Costa Rican biologist, and today I'm going to be talking about our protected areas and the importance of these protected areas for the conservation of the biodiversity and the economy of Costa Rica. I'm going to start by showing you some numbers. I have to explain to you why Costa Rica is so famous and well known for its biodiversity. Do we have the highest biodiversity of the world? Let me start by telling you the size of the country. That is going to become important on the next slide. The size of Costa Rica is roughly 50,000 square kilometers. In square miles, that is close to 20,000. In that area, we have about 8,500 species of plants, described species. We have 160 species of amphibians like this frog, close to 200 species of mammals like this monkey, 900 species of birds like this quetzal, a lot of marine species, a lot of insects. To put this in perspective, we have to compare it to a similar area in the world, somewhere else. So for instance, West Virginia is about the same size, 24,000 square miles. In West Virginia, if we look at, let's say, birds, there are 300 species, 1/3 of the number of species of birds that we have in Costa Rica. Similar for mammals, 70 versus 200, even less for amphibians, 57 amphibians and reptiles in West Virginia compared to 160 species of only amphibians in Costa Rica. This is something expected. There are always more species in the tropical areas like Costa Rica compared to the temperate zones like the United States. So the next question is Costa Rica so famous because we have way more species than other tropical countries, let's say Colombia or Brazil or Indonesia in the old world tropics? The answer is no. There are, for instance, 2,000 species of birds in Colombia alone. That is the country that has the highest diversity of birds. So why is Costa Rica so special? Well, it's special because we have the highest density of species in the world. It's a very small country, many times smaller than Colombia, many times smaller than Brazil or Indonesia. But in that small area, you see a lot of species. You want to see plants in Costa Rica, you see more plants per unit area than any other country in the world. Let's say in 1,000 square kilometers, we have more than 200 species of plants. Colombia is number 2 in the world. It has a little bit above 40. In the US, there are even less than one species in 1,000 square kilometers. In other words, you have to travel a lot. You have to cover a lot of area, a lot of ground to see many species in the United States. In Costa Rica, you see a lot in a really small area. In terms of vertebrates, terrestrial vertebrates like wild cats or sloths or monkeys, almost 30 species in 1,000 square kilometers. Ecuador, that is second, has 9. The US, way less than that. And the reason for the high diversity is that in this small country, we have a lot of different habitats, let's say, called life zones, technically, in this map. Each color corresponds to a different life zone. And there are species that are only found in those life zones. For instance, up here, we have tropical dry forests. Only in this area of the country, some animals are found only there, and some plants too. When you go to, let's say, montane forests, montane rainforests, or lowland wet forests, you see different species. So in a really short trip for a tourist or a biologist, a week or two, you can see a relatively speaking, really high proportion of the diversity of the world. We have about 5% of the world's diversity in a really small area. So that's why many people want to come to Costa Rica, to see these ecosystems in a short amount of time. Dry forests, for instance, where the trees lose their leaves during the dry season, wet areas that are evergreen the whole year, cloud forests, we have volcanoes, islands, wetlands like this mangrove forest, and all those areas have different species, as I said. High biodiversity that we almost lost in the 80s, between the 60s and the 80s. Agriculture, cattle ranching caused deforestation. At that point in time, development development means or meant cutting the forest down. And you can see this map here of forest cover, how it went down, the cover from like 75% in the 40s to 21% by the late 80s. What was left was basically the areas that were not good for agriculture. Dry forest here, gone. These dots here correspond to highlands, volcanoes that are too cold for agriculture. Same for these areas here. Other areas that were left were too remote, like this one down here, or too wet, like these areas over here. So there was hunting and poaching also going on. So we almost lost that biodiversity. All of those colors that I showed you in the previous map were not protected and the forest was gone. But something happened. Through the 90s and 2000, we recovered a lot of that forest. You can see how we doubled and then increased even further the amount of forest that we had left in the late 80s. So we ended up with like 50% of the country with some covered, forest cover, and half of that, which is roughly a quarter of the area of the country, is protected by the government under the National Conservation Areas System. And those protected areas saved our biodiversity. Most of the life zones are protected. I have to mention at this point that some of those areas are private. Not all of those protected areas are public. So here they are. These are the government protected areas. So you can see a lot of areas here in the dry forest. You can see there are many here now. And all the other life zones are covered in different conservation areas here color-coded. And we have not only national parks, there are other types of protected areas, but we have a lot of them. That is the point, even islands here and here. And in addition, there are a lot of private reserves around these public reserves. How did this happen? In the 50s, people from the United States and Europe came to Costa Rica to live. And they had seen their forests being cut in their countries, in their own countries of origin. And they had a different vision for Costa Rica. At that point in time, Costa Ricans had not seen such a heavy loss until the late 80s. So in the 50s, for instance, the Quakers that came to Monteverde and settled down there, they set aside an area of forests for water protection. At that point in time, the only national parks that we had by the government were those quote unquote useless areas for agriculture, a couple of volcanoes at that point in time in the 50s. In the 60s, some Europeans established the first protected area in the lowlands and donated it to the government. But it was not until the 70s that the government created a national park system. Thanks to the influence of this biologist, Archie Carr, he studied turtles in a town called Tortuguero. Tortuga means turtle. This is the town of turtles. A lot of turtles from many areas on the Atlantic Ocean, in this particular case, came to this small town to lay eggs. And the economy of the town was all about killing turtles to sell and eat the meat and eating the eggs. And he told the town and the government of Costa Rica, if we protect this population, if we forbid killing these turtles, eventually tourists from all over the world are going to come to Tortuguero to see the turtles, and the economy is going to be way better. The government believed that. They sent a couple of young people to study how national parks should be protected and managed for tourists. So these two Costa Ricans, biologists and forest or agriculture engineers, these two here, did that, went to the United States, came back, and with their knowledge, the government started creating a network of national parks in the lowlands, not only in the highlands anymore. In the 80s and 90s, that area was expanded. In the case of the dry forest that was totally gone, it had to be recovered. And these other biologists, Daniel Jansen from the United States, did that and donated the area to the government. The private reserves, such as the reserves in Monteverde, got expanded a lot, and that happened all over the country. Some private companies started bringing tourists. There were tour operators to those protected areas. And very important, some Costa Ricans and also residents from other countries started protecting their own forests or recovering their own forests around the government protected areas, and they built lodges for those tourists that were coming. And that is what saved the biodiversity of Costa Rica. Ecotourism, the revenue generated by tourists. We have seen an increase in the number of people that come to Costa Rica to see the biodiversity and the landscapes. The number of tourists went up from 500,000 in the 90s to more than 2 million by the end of 2017. We had almost 3 million tourists in 2019. 40% of them visited those public protected areas, and that generated revenue. This is gross revenue. In entrance fees, almost $120 million. Most of those tourists visited any of those places devoted to ecotourism, private or public. And they spend money there. On average, a tourist spends more than $1,000 in its trip. And that provides a lot of Costa Ricans with jobs. Like a third of the workforce is directly or indirectly related to the tourist industry. And in some towns that are directly adjacent to those protected areas, like Monteverde, in the case of a private one, or Tortuguero National Park, in those areas, nearly everyone works for the tourist industry. Not all areas get tourists, but in general, for the country, we're talking about 8% of the gross national income that comes directly from tourism. That is a significant proportion. And that's why it works. Costa Rica has developed this reputation of green country that attracts tourists. The local population embraces the concept and supports conservation because they see a direct benefit of conservation. That is key. And with that money, we can protect all those hectares of forest. A hectare is the size of a soccer field, by the way. 26% of the country is protected using this money, and even some territorial waters. And we keep getting more tourists, and that helps protecting all this system. There are some issues with the system. As I said, there are $120 million generated in entrance fees. That's gross revenue, but it's enough to pay for the budget on the entire conservation area system, government run. So there's enough to make a profit. But what happens is that the government takes all that money and it uses the money in different things, not only conservation. So actually the government cut this budget by $12 million in 2019. So there is enough money to make it sustainable, but it's not necessarily sustainable because of the way the money is spent. Also, this revenue system is highly susceptible to changes in the number of tourists that we get per year. And this is a particularly bad year. You're going to talk about that more in future classes, but we are not getting any tourists right now. All the traveling is closed and the protected areas are not getting international tourism. There are also environmental impacts of tourism. In a few decades, because we have more and more tourists, that means we need more and more beds to accommodate those tourists near the national parks. This is an example, national park here and the town nearby. So a lot of infrastructure has been built in areas that didn't have, let's say, the water treatment system to manage such a high amount of water, gray water, let's say. So that generates pollution. There is also pollution in the form of light, a lot of lights. Tourists don't produce a lot of light. Well, the hotels, tourists don't like lights. Bats don't like lights. Insects don't like lights, or the lights might kill them. There's also noise. There's animals. So some animals might actually abandon some regions, some trails, some portions of the forest because there is too much tourist visitation. So that is a potential problem that we need to address, because after all, we're generating all this revenue from the biodiversity, so we cannot damage the biodiversity. I'm going to end here because I only have 15 minutes for this talk. I hope this information is going to be helpful for you, for your class. Thank you very much for your attention.